first thing I want to introduce you to is a very obvious problem associated with getting out of pins. I often refer to this as the specificity problem. You will notice that there are many different ways to get pinned, and even within each separate pin, there are different ways your opponent can actually enact the pin. In other words, there are many variations of mounted position, side position, north-south. Each different pin and each different pin variation requires a precise form of escape relative to that specific scenario that you find yourself in. Imagine a situation where you have 5 padlocks in front of you and 5 keys, and you don't know which one is matched to which. Only a fool would expect one padlock key to open all 5 padlocks. Of course, the real skill would be in identifying which key is correlated with which padlock, and once you've done that, you could open all 5 padlocks without a problem. So too with pin escapes. There are different forms of pin and different variations within each one of those pins, and you must, in time, learn the appropriate way to unlock each one of those padlocks in front of you. For example, if I'm mounted on top of Shawn Williams, I can hold myself in many different ways. I can go left crossface, right crossface. We can go hand inside the lapel. We can go 2 hands on the floor. I can have my knees low down by his belt. I can have a high mounted position. There are many, many different variations within the mounted position. Side position, even more so, and north-south too. And there's a requirement on our part to use the specific escape for the specific pin that we're in. Because there is such a large number of different variations within each pin, it can be tough to lay down a precise, systematic, step-by-step approach to getting out of all pins. The system that you would propose would be rather lengthy and difficult to remember under combat conditions. So what I'm going to propose to you is a checklist system. This is essentially a heuristic approach to systems, where we offer a set of guidelines, rules of thumb, etc., to guide your behavior. Because it's a heuristic system, giving broad guidelines rather than a step-by-step algorithmic system, it gives you the flexibility required to get out of a rapidly changing pin situation where your opponent is going from one type of pin to another, or one variation of a pin to another. First, let's just have a look at the specificity problem in itself. Okay, let's say, for example, I was bottom side control, and Shawn Williams was holding one form of pin. This one here, the top head and arm, where he's got my arm and head controlled by a crossface and an underhook, and his hands are locked. Okay, this is one problem for me to deal with. If Shawn Williams took his right hand and started blocking my hip, that would create a different pin for me to get out of. Why? How does this work? Okay. Here, his right elbow is blocking my hip, and when the hands lock, he's created closed wedges around my body. This does an excellent job of controlling the movement of my head and shoulders. However, it doesn't do much to control the movement of my hips and legs, and as a result, it's not unheard of for me to get my legs inside quite easily in these situations. Okay? So Shawn Williams might be cognizant of that and take his hand and create a defensive wedge right there in front of my legs and hips. Now, it can be very difficult for me to bring my knees inside as I just did. He could strengthen this by taking his arm over to a reverse crossface position. And now my head can't move in that direction. And you can see now that my attempts to put him back in guard may well stumble and fall. So now we might have to switch entirely to a different mode of escape, where my primary emphasis now is on getting hands inside that wedge down by the hips and working my way up to a position onto my knees. From here, it may not be difficult for us to go back into guard and begin working from a guard position like so. You can see what happened here. My training partner was in one version of a pin, and he switched to a second variation. And that required, on my part, a change in an approach to escape. Initially, the elbow escape would have been just fine, but then it was blocked, and I had to switch to another mode of escape. Because there's a very large number of pins and an even larger number of pin variations, that means you've got to cover a lot of ground. and the most important thing for you to develop is a mental skill, and that is the skill of identification. The single biggest ramification of the specificity problem is that it points the way towards mastery of pin escapes. We have to become masters of identifying what is the actual problem you are trying to overcome. And because it's a dynamic problem, a problem that can change as your opponent moves around you, you've got to keep up with changes in the problem. If he presents problem A at a given moment in time and then switches to a second problem B, you've got to keep up with that. That requires on your part as a developing student an ability to identify what pin am I being held in and then correlate that with the appropriate escape. That skill of identification is going to be a huge part of your ability to get out of a punishing pin or a series of pins whenever you're underneath your opponent. I'm going to give you some rough guidelines now that will run throughout this instructional video. They will be illustrated in great detail as you go further and further into the video. But I want to give you an overview and a simple checklist system, a heuristic system, which will give you a general picture of what you're trying to accomplish when you get out of a bad position. Step number one on our checklist is always the same. Understand something. When you're in the bottom of the pin, you're vulnerable. Okay, you're not just down on points. You're in a position where you can be finished. You're in a position where your opponent can go to another form of pin and get more points against you. In other words, it's already a bad situation and it's quite easy for things to get worse. So step number one is always going to be to reduce our vulnerability. In particular, you're going to reduce your vulnerability to submission holds, and you're going to reduce your vulnerability to your opponent scoring more points on you by going to another form of pin. So say, for example, we were bottom side control. Here, I am maximally vulnerable to my opponent because I have no defensive arms in place and my arms are in an outside position. Sean Williams owns all the inside real estate. His shoulder is inside my shoulder. His right arm is inside and underneath my left arm. His right knee is inside my hip. His head is inside my shoulder. And as a result, I have no inside position whatsoever. He could hold me here all night in this position. Moreover, he would also find it very easy to go into submission holds using this underhook. He would also find it very easy to go to submission holds on the near side arm because my elbow is trapped up here, where he can easily sit into a variety of submission holds. So clearly, the first thing I need to do is to reduce my vulnerability to submissions. And that's all going to come by bringing everything inside. So our first step is going to be to take our elbow and bring the elbow inside, like so. Now we're going to reduce the vulnerability here by bringing our forearm inside and underneath our training partner's neck and jawline, or alternatively, punching through and getting inside and underneath here. Okay? You have now significantly reduced your vulnerability to your opponent's moves. Once again, if my arms start here in a rather hopeless looking situation, we have to start by reducing the vulnerability of the near arm by putting our forearm inside our training partner's hip. Then we have to bring our hand into a more sound defensive position, which denies an easy underhook control, or alternatively, gives us our own underhook. And from here, we're significantly less vulnerable. Our elbows are much closer to our own body, and we have inside position. Even when Sean Williams locks his hands tightly here, his control is rendered insignificant by my arm position. So step number one is always going to be to reduce our vulnerability to submissions. There's a second sense in which we need to decrease our vulnerability in terms of him going to another pin. So, for example, if Sean Williams pins me across side, it's quite easy for him to slide his knee across my stomach and score more points by going into the mounted position. Alternatively, he could bring his arm across, sit through, and step over into the mounted position. This too would score him additional points. So it's important in these situations that we reduce our vulnerability by bringing our body into a posture that makes that more difficult. One is to take our knee and put it here at our training partner's hip and put my foot slightly higher than my own knee. Now when my training partner goes to slide his knee across the stomach, there's considerable resistance. It's also important that my elbow go inside my training partner's hip, so that even if I was deficient with my leg position, as he goes in to slide into the mount, I could easily come out the back door on the other side. So by putting my arms in inside position and blocking hips, we're greatly reducing our vulnerability to both submission holds and to pins. So step number one in our heuristic system of escape will always be reduce your vulnerability. Okay?